Hey, Emily.
Hi, Peter.
Dr. Emily Bonistall Postel, welcome to Marsy's Law, Why We Do What We Do interview. Thank you so much. I know you're busy. You have a big election coming up. The campaign is coming to a close. Tuesday's election day. Tell us how it's feeling in Kentucky right now.
It's exciting. Honestly, it's exciting. And it is busy. Our days are very long and very full at this point, but it's been amazing. And it's such a great reminder of why we do this work. And, we get to talk to survivors and, hear from them about why they voted yes and what it means to them to vote yes. And so it's an exhausting but very rewarding time in the campaign.
Well, thank you for the great work you're doing in Kentucky. And I want to tell a little bit about your bio. If I spoke about all the work that you do and you've done on behalf of victims, would be here for the whole half hour. So I'm going to be very quick and let people know that you are the outreach director for Marsy's Law for Kentucky now. But before that, you have a PhD in sociology from the University of Delaware with expertise on victimization, and you've taught at the University of Kentucky for several years. You taught a course on victimology. And then after you taught at the University of Kentucky is when you came to Marsy's Law to do the work that you're doing now. Now, in order for people to better understand exactly how you got to the job you're at right now and what inspires you and why it is that you do what you do, I want to bring you back to your senior year in high school at Centerville High School in Dayton, Ohio. It was Mother's Day, May 1st, 2005. It was on a Sunday, and your dad got a phone call, one of the worst phone calls you could ever imagine. Tell us about that phone call.
Yeah, so it was Mother's Day, and we found out that my cousin Lindsay, who was a sophomore at the University of Delaware, she had not shown up for work that day, and her apartment had caught fire the night before. And so we were sort of kind of given the heads up and then waited to find out what happened and where she might be. And we held out hope that she was staying at a friend's house and her cell phone died and she didn't have a charger. But we found out over the course of the next few days what actually happened. And the details got worse and worse with each day.
Now, before we get into that, Lindsay Bonistall, she was your cousin.
Mm-hmm.
And you were a senior in high school, like we just said, and at the time she was a sophomore at the University of Delaware.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about your cousin Lindsay.
I love this question because I think so often we talk about how we lose our loved ones and not about our loved ones before we lost them, right? So Lindsay, I think, is best described by, I have a very big cousin, a very big family, lots of cousins. And I think everyone would describe Lindsay as like the fun, cool cousin that everyone, wanted to sit next to at Thanksgiving. And, she was so artistic. She was so talented. She could sit down. I remember sitting in my Grammy's house and she would sit down. You could play a song for her on the radio and she would sit down at the piano and play it just by ear. It was incredible. She was just a beautiful, lively, amazing person.
And at some point when you said you started to piece together what had happened, what was it that you found out that had happened the night before? I know that she was out with some friends and she was watching Saturday Night Live, and then you found out what happened after that.
Yeah, so she came back to her apartment and someone broke into her apartment. We found out that Sunday that they found her body, but at that point we didn't really know anything more than that she was found in the bathtub with a lot of debris over top of her. And the apartment had caught fire. And so we left for the funeral kind of thinking that was what had happened. It wasn't until we got there that we found out more information as it became available in the investigation. So someone broke into her apartment and brutally raped her and beat her. And the cause of death was strangulation. And this man carried her to the bathtub and left her body there and poured bleach on her to get rid of DNA and set the apartment on fire to try to cover it up. So it's really it's everything about it is horrific. And it was a sort of a piece by piece, day by day, we learned more information.
And you were only a senior in high school, and you had another cousin, is it Kristen, Lindsay's sister? And so, and your aunt and uncle, and where were they living at the time?
In New York.
And at some point, they caught the perpetrator.
They did, yes.
And he was arrested. And then, so that was the first time that your family, your extended family, had to go through the criminal justice system as survivors and victims and family members of a victim. And there was a conviction, and he was convicted of all counts and sentenced to the death penalty. And that was trial number one. And then after numerous appeals by the perpetrator, he was granted a new trial, and your family had to go through this again. And at that point, you had graduated from the University of Dayton, and you were at the University of Delaware, actually. Tell us why, while you were at the University of Dayton, because I think this is important, you were studying a course on the philosophy of women, and you were introduced to a concept of secondary victimization, and it hit you pretty hard. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I talk about this class a lot because I think it's such an important reminder that when you lose a loved one the way that we lost Lindsay, the effects of that are reach far beyond just that individual person, right? Families, communities, loved ones, partners, the whole deal, right? Everyone is affected by this. And yet, because it didn't actually happen to me, I really struggled with how deeply I was affected by her death. And so I found that I had what I know now to be a lot of the same kinds of signs and symptoms of PTSD. So, just really being scared and being terrified about, bad things happening to people that I loved. It really just completely shocked my entire world. And so when I learned about this concept of secondary victimization, and that being a family member of a victim, what we now call homicide survivors, that was normal, what I was going through, that I was not the only person who was feeling this way, that there are terms and theories and ways to understand and explain how I was feeling. It was one of the most validating experiences for me. And so to me, that really was an important point in my healing process, where instead of carrying shame about how much it had affected me and in the ways that it had affected me, that I was able to sort of refocus and think about, finding a career that would make Lindsay proud as well.
And it inspired you to go and pursue your PhD in sociology.
It did, yes.
And that brought you back to the University of Delaware. And that must have been tough for you and your parents too, to go, and that was probably a pretty brave thing for you to do, was actually to go to the University of Delaware.
Yeah, in a doctoral program, programs are really only as good as the people that you study under. And some of the best folks for studying victimization were at the University of Delaware. And I was really, really lucky to be able to get in and study with them. And so it was a hard decision. And, we talked with the family about it, and, with their support, decided to move forward with it. And ultimately, over the course of 7 years, it was really special to be there and to have some of those connections to her. I remember standing somewhere and giving my name, and they said, "Bonistall, is that Lindsay or Emily?" And the thought that I was standing somewhere exactly where Lindsay had stood before, it just kind of wraps you in a hug.
Yeah, and you talk about a lot of these things that have happened in your life. You could call them Lindsay things, and that was probably another Lindsay thing. And another Lindsay thing was, as tough as it was for your family to have to go through not just one trial, but now a second trial, you happened to be in Delaware for the second trial, and so you were able to attend it. Now, this was your first time having to navigate the criminal justice system in a pretty tough spot as somebody who's going to have to experience everything that had happened to Lindsay, all of that story in the courtroom. And you were introduced to somebody that you referred to as a trial angel. It was the first time you were ever introduced to a victim witness advocate. Her name was Mary Ann. And I just want to read something that you actually wrote about your experience in the courtroom. I can still feel the warmth of Mary Ann's hand on my shoulder in the freezing cold courtroom. It was the day in my cousin's murder trial where they would be showing photos of her burned apartment and what was left of her body after she had been raped, strangled, and set on fire. Mary Ann was our trial angel, our victim's advocate. She let us know in advance what to expect. The photos would be shown in the morning session. They would be up for a few minutes, and we should prepare ourselves for some gasps from people in the jury. She would place her hand on our shoulder, and that was our sign to look down and close our eyes. When the photos were gone, she would remove her hand. The warmth of her hand in a very cold courtroom is something I will never forget. That simple gesture was truly victim-centered and trauma-informed. You see, Mary Ann saved me from nightmares and flashbacks and from something that couldn't be unseen. To her, it was part of her job. It was a small gesture, quite literally a movement of her hand. But to me, it was a gift. Because of that warm hand on my shoulder, the lasting image in my head of my beautiful cousin is not the remains of her burned body. Now that's about as powerful a description of a courtroom experience that I think anyone could ever hear. And when you talk about that, and you talk about the concept of being truly victim-centered and trauma-informed, and how important you realize that at the moment, and through your teaching at UK and what you do now, tell us a little bit about that.
You know, I don't think I realized it then what that was. It wasn't really until I was teaching and I got into this work as a professional that I understood, you know, that Mary Ann and many of the experiences that we had, the prosecution team was just incredible. That we had this opportunity to see how the criminal justice system can go right. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of ways that it went wrong, right? And that's not, I defer those conversations to my aunt and uncle. But I got to see how the system can go right by people like Mary Ann. And so to me, that is why I am so passionate about Marsy's Law, because I know that when you treat victims with dignity and respect, I know that when they are given you know, a meaningful experience in the justice system, what that can do for their healing, what that can do for, you know, for their involvement. And so, you know, these kinds of rights that Marsy's Law provides are meaningful because of the experiences that it gives victims, and because of the type of people like Mary Ann.
Yeah, and in your experience in particular, Emily, the fact that there were two trials, it really highlights, and a sentencing and a resentencing, it really highlights the fact that when someone is victimized and their family is victimized, it's not really just a snapshot. It's really just the beginning of a long process, and a long, painful process that can be helped if people are given meaningful and enforceable rights as victims and as survivors. And you recounted to me, I remember when we were talking at one point about a victim impact and a victim impact statement, and how the fact that with Lindsay's trial, the fact that there were two trials, her sister, Kristen, your cousin, got up and gave a victim impact statement that you were able to hear at the second trial. And it was particularly meaningful to you because it was 5 years after the first trial. So it wasn't just a concept of how she thought that this was going to impact her life. She was able to report during those 5 years how it actually had impacted her life. Impacted her life. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I'll never forget hearing Kristen's words of, the fact that she had a baby, she got married and didn't have Lindsay as her maid of honor. She got pregnant and had a baby and didn't have Lindsay as the godmother. And so it really, I think, shows the ripple effect and the impact that, as you said, it's not just this one moment, this snapshot in time of what happened. It's about the void that is left in this world when people that we love are taken from us. And I think there was a unique opportunity to be able to really capture that in the second victim impact statement.
And so you pursued your dream of being an educator at that point, and then it was fulfilled when you got your job at the University of Kentucky, teaching your course on victimology. And what is the there was one thing that you say, that you don't let your students leave your class until they can answer one question. What question is that?
So my students every single semester have to be able to answer the question of what is the common reaction to crime? What is the standard reaction to experiencing crime? And I give, sometimes some semesters it's a multiple choice question, sometimes it's an essay question. But the answer, of course, is that there is no standard reaction to crime. And so in my role as an educator in this area, so much of what I try to focus on is really challenging our expectations of how people should act, right? What we think about how people should be acting, based on, movies and Law and Order, SVU and things like this, right? That if somebody is not acting in the way that we would expect them to, then maybe they're not telling the truth, or maybe they aren't actually as affected by this. And so I actually do, one of my favorite things to do is training with professionals who interact with victims, because I think, again, from a victim-centered perspective, if you can understand how trauma works and how trauma shows up in people's lives and how that will be different for everyone and how there is no standard reaction to crime, if we can understand that, then when we interact with victims, we can do so in a way that is much more meaningful and much more respectful of each individual person's experience.
And while you were teaching at the University of Kentucky, you told me that one of the guest speakers that you brought in was someone that talked to your class about an initiative that was just making its way through Kentucky, called Marsy's Law. Mm-hmm. What interested you in Marsy's Law? What drew you to it in the first place?
So in my victimology class, I have a unit on the history of the victims' rights movement, and in that we talk a lot about crime victims' rights, what we do have, what we don't have. We talk a lot about just some of the way that rights and the impact of victimization and healing and support and all of this is connected. And so when I got to the unit on crime victims' rights and discovered that Marsy's Law was happening here, the effort for it was happening here in our state, I invited Ashley, who was the director who had my position before now. I invited her to come and talk to the class, and I thought, I don't know if she'll come. And she was thrilled to come and speak with our students, and it was amazing to hear about all of the work that had gone into, what was going to be on the ballot. I mean, she shared with us about all of the different town halls and, the different groups that they had gotten together to, weigh in and help really craft this. I mean, this is Marsy's Law for Kentucky is Marsy's Law for Kentucky. It's written for Kentuckians by Kentuckians. And so, to hear her lecture outline all of this and to hear about everything that had gone into it, and then to think that my students were going to be able to vote on this that year was just so exciting. And so I had her come back to my class a few different semesters to be able to speak about this effort and what it means.
And they did that, and then your students were able to vote on it, and it passed. But here we are again, because through some court intervention, the details of which we don't need to get into now, but the result of which is Marsy's Law is back on the ballot with more information on the actual ballot for the voters to read every single word about Marsy's Law. And so it's back on the ballot for Tuesday. And and an interesting twist in your journey, like you just told us, the director of outreach, Ashley, who spoke in your class, that is the job that you now have at Marsy's Law as the director of outreach. And tell us what you're doing as far as you're educating. You're now, instead of educating students, you're educating victim organizations and voters about Marsy's Law.
Yeah, it's kind of an incredible journey that has taken us to this moment. I never thought I would leave the classroom. I thought that's where I was going to be. And I'm honestly, at this point, I can say I'm kind of surprised at how similar my job is now from what it was before. I mean, I'm spending the vast majority of my time, educating about these kinds of things, talking about the impact of victimization, talking about, crime victims' rights and the history of the movement and how that has influenced where we are now and where we see ourselves. And I, am, as an academic, of course, I'm proud to say that I've been able to use a lot of the research that, I would have my students read in classes. I reference that stuff all the time in my conversations with folks. So it's been incredibly rewarding to be able to interact one-on-one with survivors and to validate them and give them that moment that I had in class. I've been able to give that to survivors across the state, which has been very, very cool. And that's been great. And then I do, a lot of voter education for, the general voter on what this is and why we need it. Doing a lot of clarification on why we're doing this again, right? So to your point, Marsy's Law was not deemed to be unconstitutional. It was just about the language that's on the ballot. And so that's why people, when you vote, you see the full language. So it's fun. It's so different than what I was doing, and yet just the same.
Right. And to break it down into its very simplest terms for voters, which they will be able to see every word on the ballot. But for its very simplest terms, it's vote yes on Amendment 1.
That's right.
And so it's back on the ballot after this long journey. And you wrote an op-ed where you quote an author, Roy Bennett, where do what is right, not what is easy. So it has not been easy. For your job in educating the voters and educating all of the different organizations. But what you have done on behalf of victims and will do on behalf of victims once Marsy's Law becomes a reality in Kentucky is so invaluable. Now, what is it that you would want voters to know about Marsy's Law as they go to the ballot?
So the thing that has been, I think, the most surprising to me is, as I talk with voters across the state, is that people are really surprised to find out that under our current law, we don't have the right to be present at trial. And the reason that's surprising to me, I think, is because anyone here in Kentucky who has been through the system as a victim, and most folks who work with victims in the system, they know that, and they know that firsthand, and they know that that's one of the many reasons why we need Marsy's Law. And so when I talk with folks who have gone through this, and I explain Marsy's Law, I'd never hear, well, why do we need this? Because they know why we need this. And so when I talk with voters who are surprised to hear about some of these things, and they say, well, why do we need Marsy's Law? To me, that is such, it's indicative of the blessing of not having to know why we need this, right? Of not having to have gone through the system yourself. And so, when voters are reading over Marsy's Law, when they are going to cast their vote, whether that's in person or hopefully absentee if you've already done it, I really hope that folks think about the people who are asking them to vote yes, because they are survivors. They're family members of crime victims. They are the people who work in the system, who support victims in, all different aspects of their needs, both during and after. And so that's who's asking voters vote yes on Amendment 1. And so that's really what I hope folks think about, and who they think about when they vote yes.
Yeah, and to the point that we were talking about before, that being victimized is not just a snapshot, but it's really a process, and it's a long journey with many different chapters. I think your cousin's case, and the case that your family had to go through and endure, is a perfect example of the importance of the different rights that Marsy's Law affords to all victims. The right to be notified. I mean, when you think about all of the different hearings that your family had to be notified of and to be present at, and the right to be present at, the trial itself, the retrial, the sentencing, and the resentencing, and of course the victim impact statements. And those, as you saw, those victim impact statements are very meaningful, not just for a judge to hear, but also for your family to hear and to be able to and to be able to absorb. You talked about how important that was for you, for closure, to honor your cousin's memory. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that I could say to this, right? And this idea of closure, I think, is one that's, when folks talk about closure, it's not about closure from the grief of losing somebody that you love. It's closure from the system. And so when you have an experience like we had, where, you know, my family had to go through an entirely second trial, and then there were a whole host of things that happened after that we don't have time to get into. But you know, I hear this all the time in my work right now with victims across the state, that you know, it's one hearing after another, and then it's parole, and then it's, you know, closure from the system is one of the things that is just as important. And that's because the system can be really, really hard. And so we need Marsy's Law. We need to make sure that victims are treated with respect and dignity, that they're these basic rights, that they're upheld and that they're enforced. And you know, that is something that I cannot state that enough, of the impact that has on victims going through the system.
Right, and the importance that you always talk about of everybody being victim-centered and trauma-informed, I think would probably be much easier if, once Marsy's Law is passed in Kentucky, hopefully if everything goes well on election day, that it creates a culture, really a statewide culture, that you don't even really need to be in the space of victim advocacy to realize, when a culture like that is created, that everybody can be victim-centered and trauma-informed. And you talk about that as in your work that you talk to your students about, which is, even if you don't get into this to help victims, just be kind. And that's a way to be victim-centered and trauma-informed. So I just want to thank you for all the incredible work that you've done. Your story is absolutely incredible. It's so inspirational that you turned that incredible pain as a senior in high school into the work that you do now. And hopefully Marsy's Law, once it's passed, the rights that are afforded to all the crime victims can serve as that warm hand on the shoulder of all victims of Kentucky, much in the way that your trial angel, your victim witness advocate, Marianne, did for you when you had to sit and endure that trial in Delaware. So thank you so much, Emily, and good luck on Tuesday.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
Thanks.